just before 6 o'clock on the morning of the 31st of March 2001, an ambulance turned into a private property in Roydon, Essex. Beside the outdoor swimming pool, a man was lying unconscious. His name was Stuart Lubbock. He was 31 years old. Only a few hours earlier, he'd been out in Harlow enjoying a Friday night. Now, people were trying to keep him alive. The house belonged to Michael Barrymore, one of the biggest television stars in Britain, a man whose face had been beamed into millions of homes for more than a decade. But there were no cameras here, no studio audience, no applause, just 9 people at the end of a party that had gone catastrophically wrong. Stuart was taken to Princess Alexandra Hospital. Doctors continued trying to save him. At 8:23 that morning, he was pronounced dead. At first, it looked possible that Stuart had drowned after a night of alcohol, drugs and late-night swimming. Then doctors examined his body, and the case changed completely. Stuart had suffered serious internal injuries that raised the possibility that something violent had happened to him before he entered the water. From that moment, this was no longer simply a tragic accident. It was a mystery involving 8 surviving people, a famous television entertainer, a police investigation that would later be heavily criticised, and a father who would spend the next 20 years refusing to stop asking what had happened to his son. Michael Barrymore has never been charged with causing Stuart Lubbock's death and has consistently denied involvement. But more than 25 years later, nobody has ever been convicted of causing Stuart's injuries either. And despite investigations, arrests, an inquest and decades of publicity, one fundamental question remains unanswered. What happened to Stuart Lubbock in the final hours of his life? Welcome back to What They Hide, Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight. I'm Matt, and I'm your host. As always, thank you so much for joining me. If you enjoy the podcast, please consider following or subscribing, leaving a rating or review, and sharing the show with somebody you think might enjoy it. And if you'd like to support the podcast directly, you can do that through Buy Me a Coffee. The link will be in the description. Every little bit of support helps me continue producing these shows, and it really is appreciated. Before we begin, a quick content warning. This episode contains discussion of death, drug and alcohol use, alleged sexual assault, and serious physical injuries. Some of the details may be distressing. Listener discretion is advised. Right, let's crack on with the show. Alright! If you watched British television in the 1990s, you can probably hear Michael Barrymore saying it. Not just the word, the voice, the grin, the audience shouting it back. Because there was a time when Michael Barrymore was almost impossible to avoid. Saturday night ITV, huge studio audiences, millions watching at home, and Barrymore bouncing around in the middle of it all. This was before streaming, before catch-up television, before everyone disappeared into their own individual screens. A big entertainment show could stop an entire family in front of the television at the same time. And Barrymore had some very big shows. His breakthrough had come after years of work in holiday camps, clubs and theatres. Born Michael Kieran Parker in Bermondsey, South London, he'd worked as a Butlins redcoat before appearing on the television talent show New Faces in 1979. But the programme that really changed his life came several years later. Strike It Lucky. On paper, it was a game show. Contestants answered questions, moved across television screens and tried to avoid the dreaded hotspot. In reality, the game was often the least interesting thing happening. Barrymore made the contestants the entertainment. He'd ask somebody what they did for a living, and somehow 5 minutes later, the entire studio would be laughing at a story nobody could possibly have planned. He could be chaotic, physical, completely unpredictable, but underneath all of that was a very sharp television performer. Barrymore knew people. More importantly, he knew how to get ordinary people talking, and audiences loved him for it. Top, middle or bottom? What is a hot spot not? A good spot? It came part of British television culture. Then came Barrymore, my kind of people, my kind of music. Kids say the funniest things. By the 1990s, he wasn't just a bloke from Strike It Lucky anymore. He was one of ITV's biggest stars, and the awards proved it. When the National Television Awards began in the mid-1990s, Barrymore repeatedly won the public vote for entertainment presenter. That matters. These weren't industry executives choosing him. The viewers were, the people sitting at home. And they chose Michael Barrymore again and again. His appeal was unusual. He could walk into an audience, find somebody completely unknown, put an arm round them, and somehow make them feel like they belonged on television. There was warmth to him. There was also chaos. You never quite knew what Barrymore was going to do next. Sometimes you suspected Barrymore didn't either. And that was part of why people watched. But his private life was far less straightforward. Barrymore struggled with alcohol and drugs and entered rehabilitation in the 1990s. In 1995, he publicly announced that he was gay. His marriage to his wife Cheryl subsequently ended. All of it played out under intense tabloid scrutiny. Yet somehow his career survived. That tells you something about just how popular he was. Scandals that might have finished other entertainers didn't finish Barrymore. The audience kept coming back. ITV kept putting him on television. And as Britain entered a new century, Michael Barrymore was still a household name. He was 48 years old, rich, famous, recognised almost everywhere he went, and living with his partner Jonathan Kenny at a large house in Roydon, Essex. It had extensive grounds, privacy, and an outdoor swimming pool. On Friday the 30th of March 2001, Barrymore went out in nearby Harlow. There was no reason to think the night would be particularly important. Certainly nothing to suggest that within hours his television career would effectively be over. Because somewhere else in Harlow that evening, another man was getting ready for a night out. His life looked nothing like Barrymore's. No television cameras, no awards, no newspaper interviews. His name was Stuart Lubbock, and before the sun came up the following morning, Britain would know his name too. Stuart Lubbock was 31 years old. He lived in Harlow, he worked in the meat trade, and he had 2 young daughters. He wasn't famous, there were no television archives of him, no interviews, no public persona. Most of what survives about Stuart comes from the people who knew him, and from the case that followed his death. He was remembered as sociable, friendly, someone who enjoyed going out. And on Friday the 30th of March 2001, that was exactly what he did. For Stuart, the night began in the most ordinary way possible. A Friday night in Harlow. Drinks, friends, music, nothing arranged in advance, nothing pointing toward the house of a television celebrity. And certainly nothing pointing towards the end of his life. His father, Terry, was at home. At that point, Terry wasn't a campaigner. He wasn't appearing on television. He wasn't standing outside police stations holding photographs of his son. He was simply Stuart's dad. That would change the following morning. But first, Stuart went out. At some point during the evening, he made his way to the Millennium nightclub in Harlow. And inside, was Michael Barrymore. Not on stage, not presenting a show, just out for the night. Barrymore was there with his partner, Jonathan Kenny, and others from their group. His presence naturally drew attention. People recognised him, spoke to him, joined the group, and somewhere during the night, Stuart did the same. Exactly how the first conversation began isn't clear. There's no reliable record of the words exchanged. What matters is that the two men met. They'd never known each other before that night. Stuart wasn't connected to Barrymore's television career. He wasn't part of his social circle. It was simply a chance encounter. But as the night continued, Stuart began spending time with Barrymore and the others around him. Then came the invitation. Barrymore lived only a short distance away in Roydon. The night didn't have to end at the club. They could carry on drinking at his house. For Stuart, it must have sounded surreal. You go out in Harlow, you meet Michael Barrymore, and suddenly you're heading back to his place for an after party. There was a group going, he wasn't leaving alone, so Stuart went with them. The Millennium was left behind. The group divided between vehicles and began the short drive towards Roydon. Harlow's nightlife faded behind them. The roads became quieter, darker, and before long they reached Barrymore's home. 9 people would eventually be inside the property. There was alcohol, there were drugs, there was music, and there was an outdoor swimming pool. At that point, it was just still an after party. But over the next few hours, the group would break apart into different rooms and different conversations. People would swim, move around, lose track of one another, and somewhere inside that confusion, Stuart's final hours would become almost impossible to reconstruct. By dawn, he would be dead. The group arrived at Michael Barrymore's home in Roydon in the early hours of Saturday morning. 9 people would be there that night. Barrymore, his partner Jonathan Kenny, Stuart Lubbock, Justin Merritt and his sister Kylie, James Footers, Simon Shaw, Claire Jones and Kelly Campbell. Some knew Barrymore already, others had joined the group during the evening. Stuart had only met him hours earlier. Once inside, the night carried on. Drinks were poured, music played, people moved between the house, the garden and the pool. It was the end of March, cold outside, but the swimming pool still became part of the party. Clothes came off, people got into the water, Stuart joined them, and for a while nothing about the scene appears unusual. Just a late night gathering, getting increasingly chaotic. Then drugs entered the picture. At the later inquest, Kylie Merritt would allege that Barrymore put cocaine onto his finger and rubbed it into Stuart's gums. Barrymore denied that account. Justin Merritt also alleged that Barrymore had supplied cocaine during the party. Again, these were allegations, but they gave investigators a clearer picture of the kind of night they were trying to reconstruct. Alcohol, cocaine, ecstasy, swimming, people moving in and out of rooms, people splitting into smaller groups, and no one paying much attention to the clock. That matters, because the crucial period in this case isn't several hours long. It's much narrower than that. Somewhere during the party, Stuart was seen drinking. He was seen around the jacuzzi. He was seen in the pool. At one point he was described as dive-bombing into the water. Then the sightings became less useful. Not because Stuart disappeared completely, but because nobody followed his movements continuously. Different people remembered different moments. One person saw him here, another remembered him there. Then there were gaps, and those gaps would later become the focus of the investigation. Who was with Stuart? Who was inside? Who was outside? Who had gone to another room? And who, if anyone, had been alone with him? There are also reports of sexual remarks during the night. A taxi driver later described Barrymore making a sexual comment towards Stuart during the journey from the nightclub. Other later evidence suggested that Barrymore may have shown a sexual interest in him. Barrymore has always denied any involvement in Stuart's injuries or death, but investigators would later examine those accounts closely, because by then they knew something the people at the party didn't. Stuart had suffered serious internal injuries, and whatever had caused them had happened close to the time he died. But at this point in the night, no one was talking about injuries. No one was talking about police. The party was still going. Then, before dawn, something changed. Someone noticed Stuart in the swimming pool. He was unresponsive. The night stopped immediately. People rushed towards the water. Stuart was pulled out. Attempts were made to revive him, and within minutes, the atmosphere inside the house had gone from chaotic to desperate. Someone called 999. An ambulance was on the way, but there was already another complication. Michael Barrymore had left the property. He went to the nearby home of Simon Shaw. Barrymore later said he had panicked, that he was frightened, that he didn't know what to do. Whatever the reason, by the time the police began dealing with the scene, the owner of the house was no longer there. Back by the pool, Stuart still wasn't responding. Paramedics arrived shortly before 6. They took over the attempt to save him, and then Stuart was moved from the house to Princess Alexandra Hospital in Harlow. At that moment, the people left behind still had no idea what doctors were about to find, because the emergency had begun as a suspected drowning. Within hours, it would become something far more serious. Stuart Lubbock was taken from Barrymore's home to Princess Alexandra Hospital in Harlow. Doctors tried to save him. They couldn't. At 8:23 that morning, Stuart was pronounced dead. He was 31 years old. At first, drowning seemed the obvious explanation. There had been drinking, drug use, late-night swimming. A man had been found unconscious in a pool. Then the post-mortem began, and everything changed. The pathologist found serious internal injuries around Stuart's anus. They were recent, they were severe, and they raised the possibility that Stuart had been sexually assaulted before he died. Suddenly, this wasn't simply a question of how a heavily intoxicated man had ended up in a swimming pool. It was a question of what had happened to him before he entered the water. Toxicology added another layer. Stuart had alcohol in his system, cocaine, MDMA. Those substances could have contributed to his death, but they couldn't explain the injuries, and that distinction became crucial. The medical evidence suggested there were at least two separate questions. Why did Stuart die? And how did he sustain those injuries? They might have been connected. They might not. But investigators now had to consider the possibility that a serious assault had taken place inside Barrymore's home. That should have made the house one of the most important crime scenes in Britain. The problem was that the opportunity to preserve it perfectly had already begun to slip away. The initial police response had been shaped by an assumption of drowning. People had moved around, items had been touched, potential evidence had not been secured with the urgency that would later seem necessary. And once investigators realised they might be dealing with an assault, they were already working from behind. That would haunt the case. Years later, reviews of the investigation identified significant failures in the way evidence had been handled and forensic opportunities pursued. Some examinations that should have happened quickly were delayed for years. Some items disappeared before they could ever be properly tested. One of those was a pool thermometer, photographed at the scene. Another object later discussed was a detached door handle. Neither has ever been proved to have caused Stuart's injuries, but that is exactly the problem. They were never properly excluded either. By the time detectives fully understood the significance of the injuries, the perfect version of the crime scene no longer existed. And from that point onwards, the investigation would depend far more heavily on the people who had been inside the house. What had they seen? Who had been where? When was Stuart last seen conscious? Who was near the pool? And who could account for their movements during the crucial period? The answers were messy. Some witnesses remembered Stuart drinking, some remembered him in the jacuzzi, some remembered him swimming, some described sexual comments, some disputed what others had said. Barrymore denied involvement in Stuart's injuries or death, and has always maintained that he did not know what happened. But police now had a dead man with unexplained injuries and 8 surviving witnesses who could not provide a complete sequence of events. That was the shape of the case from this point on. Strong suspicion that something serious had happened. Very little forensic evidence capable of identifying who was responsible. And a timeline full of gaps. For Stuart's father, Terry, the medical findings transformed grief into something else. Because if Stuart had been assaulted, then somewhere inside that house was an explanation. And Terry wanted it. He would spend the next 20 years trying to get it. "18 months after Stuart's death, the evidence was examined in public at an inquest. By then, the central problem was already clear. There had been 9 people at Barrymore's home, but there was no single account explaining Stuart's final hours. The witnesses had seen different things, remembered different moments, and sometimes contradicted one another. The inquest heard about alcohol, drugs, the pool, the jacuzzi, movements through the house, and the allegations surrounding Barrymore's behaviour towards Stuart. Kylie Merritt repeated her claim that Barrymore had put cocaine onto his finger and rubbed it onto Stuart's gums. Barrymore denied it. Other evidence suggested Barrymore may have shown a sexual interest in Stuart during the evening. Again, Barrymore denied any involvement in Stuart's injuries or death. And crucially, none of those allegations proved who had assaulted Stuart. They were pieces, not an answer. The same problem applied to the timeline. One witness remembered Stuart drinking, another remembered him swimming, another placed him elsewhere in the house. But no one could follow his movements continuously through the period that mattered most. And ultimately, that was the problem. There were fragments of Stuart's final hours, but no complete sequence. One person remembered seeing him drinking, another remembered him around the pool. There were accounts of drug use, accounts of sexual remarks, different recollections of who had been where, but no witness could take investigators through Stuart's final movements from beginning to end, and no witness could explain the injuries found on his body. That was the evidence eventually brought into public view. In September 2002, 18 months after Stuart died, the inquest into his death began. For Terry Lubbock, this was important. Until now, much of what we knew had come through police investigations, medical reports and conversations behind closed doors. At the inquest, the people who had been inside the Roydon house would have to give their accounts publicly. Michael Barrymore was among them. He denied causing Stuart's injuries. He denied responsibility for his death, and he maintained that he didn't know what had happened. The medical evidence didn't provide the answer either. There was evidence consistent with drowning. There were significant levels of alcohol and drugs in Stuart's system, but there were also the serious internal injuries, and precisely how those different elements fitted together remained uncertain. This is an important distinction. Medical evidence could tell investigators a great deal about Stuart's body. It couldn't tell them who had been standing beside him at a critical moment. It couldn't tell them who had caused the injuries, and it couldn't reconstruct the missing minutes inside the Roydon house. After days of evidence, the inquest reached its conclusion. On Friday the 13th of September 2002, an open verdict was returned. No definitive cause or circumstance of Stuart's death could be established, and Terry walked away without the thing he had wanted most, an explanation. But something had changed. because Terry was no longer prepared simply to wait for one. By then, his grief had become a campaign. He began appearing regularly in the media. He challenged Essex police over the original investigation. He questioned how evidence had been handled, and he repeatedly appealed to the people who had been inside the house. Terry's belief was straightforward. 9 people had been there. Stuart was dead. Somebody had to know something. That didn't mean Terry could identify the person responsible. He couldn't, but he refused to accept that his son's death should simply disappear into an open verdict. And gradually, Terry became the person keeping the case alive. When newspapers moved on, Terry didn't. When television moved on, Terry didn't. When years began passing without prosecution, Terry didn't. For Michael Barrymore, those same years looked very different. Before Stuart's death, Barrymore had been one of the biggest entertainers on British television. After it, the atmosphere around him changed almost overnight. His programmes disappeared. The big ITV career that had taken decades to build was effectively over, and Barrymore eventually left Britain for New Zealand. Think back to where we began this episode. The studio audience. All white? Strike It Lucky? My Kind of People? The National Television Awards? Millions watching? Now that world had gone. Barrymore had not been convicted of causing Stuart's death. He hadn't even been charged with causing it. But in the public mind, his name and Stuart's death had become almost impossible to separate. Every interview risked returning to Roydon. Every photograph brought back the swimming pool. Every attempted comeback carried the same question with it. For several years, Michael Barrymore largely disappeared from the British television landscape, and it might have stayed that way. Then, at the beginning of 2006, came an offer that was either incredibly brave or completely mad, depending on how you looked at it. Celebrity Big Brother. The programme offered almost the exact opposite of the controlled television world Barrymore had once dominated. There was no polished game show format, no auto cue, no studio audience waiting for the catchphrase. There were cameras everywhere, 24 hours a day, and if Barrymore wanted the British public to decide what they thought of him, they were about to get plenty of opportunity. On the 5th of January 2006, Michael Barrymore walked into the Celebrity Big Brother house. The reaction was enormous. This wasn't simply another aging television personality appearing on reality TV. Barrymore had barely been seen on mainstream British television for years. Now millions of people were watching him eat breakfast, talk, argue, cry, laugh, and live alongside a collection of other celebrities. For the first time since Stuart's death, viewers weren't seeing Barrymore through a newspaper photograph. They were seeing him, and something unexpected happened. He connected with a significant part of the audience again. There were difficult moments. Barrymore could appear fragile, emotional, at times erratic, but there were also flashes of the entertainer people remembered. The quick humour, the warmth, the ability to turn an ordinary conversation into something funny. And week after week, he stayed, until eventually Michael Barrymore reached the final. He finished second, runner-up. 5 years after his career appeared to have collapsed, the British public had almost voted him the winner of Celebrity Big Brother. For Barrymore, it looked like the beginning of something. Maybe rehabilitation, maybe a comeback, maybe even a route back into mainstream television. But outside that house was another man whose life has not moved on at all. Terry Lubbock. And within weeks of Barrymore's return to public life, Terry and Michael Barrymore would finally sit down together. No television audience, no police interview room, no lawyers speaking for them. Just the father of Stuart Lubbock, and the man whose home Stuart had entered on the final night of his life. Face to face. Late January 2006, Michael Barrymore had just walked out of the Celebrity Big Brother house, second place, runner-up, and suddenly, after years of headlines and exile from mainstream television, people were talking about him as an entertainer again. But before any comeback could really begin, there was someone he needed to face. Terry Lubbock. The two men met in a London hotel. For around 2 hours they sat together and talked about Stuart. No audience, no eviction vote, no studio lights, just the father of a dead man and the owner of the house where his son had spent his final hours. Terry later said something that surprised a lot of people. He told Barrymore, "I don't hold you responsible for Stuart's death. I never have." Barrymore was reported to have replied that what had happened haunted him every day. It was an extraordinary exchange, because by then the two men had been pushed into opposite corners by years of headlines. Barrymore had become the face most closely associated with the case. Terry had become the father demanding answers. But sitting across from one another, the reality was more complicated. Terry wasn't telling Barrymore that the case was over. He wasn't saying there were no questions left to answer. He was saying something more specific. He didn't believe Barrymore himself was responsible for Stuart's death. What Terry still wanted was the truth about what had happened inside that house. Who had seen what? Who knew more? And why nobody had been able to explain the injuries found on Stuart's body? That distinction matters, because Terry's campaign was never simply, "Michael Barrymore did this." It was, "My son entered that house alive. He came out dead. Somebody needs to explain what happened." And after 5 years, Terry still didn't have that explanation. The meeting with Barrymore didn't give him one. But it did something else. It showed how far the case had moved beyond a simple celebrity scandal. There were now two separate stories running alongside one another. Barrymore was trying to recover a life that had collapsed after 2001. Terry was trying to understand why Stuart's life had ended in the first place. And neither story was finished, because later that same year, the investigation began moving again. By 2006, concerns about the original Essex police inquiry had become impossible to ignore. Terry had repeatedly criticised the way the scene had been handled. Evidence had been missed, potential forensic opportunities had been lost, and the open verdict at the inquest had left the case unresolved. Then new material was submitted to police. In December 2006, Essex police announced that they were reopening the investigation into Stuart's death. This time, detectives were going back over everything. The witness statements, the medical evidence, the movements inside the house, the timings, and especially the gaps. They wanted to know exactly when each man could be accounted for, and when they couldn't. That became crucial, because investigators knew Stuart's injuries had to have been sustained within a relatively limited window. So they began mapping who might have had the opportunity to be alone with him. Not proof, opportunity. There is a huge difference between the two. But after years of uncertainty, police were finally trying to reduce the possibilities. Michael Barrymore was one of the men whose movements were examined. So was Jonathan Kenny. So was Justin Merritt. And once again, the Roydon house became the centre of an active criminal investigation. For Terry, this must have felt like the case had been pulled back from the dead. 5 years after the original inquiry appeared to stall, detectives were looking again. Old evidence was being reconsidered, new pathology work was being examined, witnesses were being revisited, and for the first time in years, there was genuine movement. But there was also a problem: time. By 2006, more than 5 years had passed. Memories fade, relationships change, people move, objects disappear, and forensic evidence that could have been collected in hours cannot always be recreated years later. That was the handicap the new investigation inherited. They were trying to solve a case whose strongest opportunities may already have been lost. Still, detectives pressed on, and by the summer of 2007, the investigation had reached a point that would once again send Michael Barrymore's name across every newspaper front page in Britain. On the 14th of June, 2007, police arrested him, not over drugs, not over some technical breach, on suspicion of the rape and murder of Stuart Lubbock. Jonathan Kenny and Justin Merritt were also arrested as part of the investigation. 6 years after Stuart died, 3 men who had been inside the house were now being questioned about the most serious allegations possible. For Terry, this was the moment he had spent years pushing towards, not because an arrest proved anything, it didn't, but because at last the case appeared to be moving towards the possibility of charges, a trial, evidence tested in open court, answers, and then, once again, the momentum stopped. The evidence was reviewed, and it wasn't enough. No charges were brought. Barrymore, Kenny and Merritt were released without prosecution. The case had reached the edge of the courtroom and fallen back again. For Terry it was another devastating near miss. For Barrymore it would trigger a completely different legal battle, because years later he would argue that the arrest itself had been unlawful, and that fight would eventually reach the Court of Appeal. But before we get there, another body had started looking at the original investigation, not at whether Barrymore was guilty, not at whether anyone should be prosecuted, but at something just as important: whether the police had failed Stuart from the very beginning. February 2009. Nearly 8 years had passed since Stuart Lubbock died. By now, Terry had spent years saying that the original investigation had gone badly wrong. Not because police had failed to produce the answers he wanted, but because opportunities had been missed at the very beginning. The first hours, the house, the pool, the clothes, the blood, the objects around the scene. And now an independent watchdog had examined those complaints. The Independent Police Complaints Commission published its findings, and some of them were deeply uncomfortable for Essex police. The IPCC did not conclude that officers had acted corruptly. It did not accept Terry's claim that the entire investigation had been fundamentally incompetent. But it did identify serious failures. The scene at Barrymore's home had not been effectively protected. Potentially important evidence had not been secured, and forensic opportunities had been lost. That matters because in a case like this, the first hours are everything. Evidence is at its freshest, memories are at their clearest, objects are still where they were left, clothing has not been washed, surfaces have not been cleaned, and if somebody has been assaulted, there is the best possible chance of finding out how. At the Roydon house, some of those chances disappeared. The IPCC found that a swimming pool thermometer and a detached door handle had never been seized. Both later went missing. No one can say that either object caused Stuart's injuries. That has never been proved. But because neither was properly examined, investigators also lost the chance to exclude them properly. There were other problems. Blood found on Stuart's boxer shorts was not fully investigated at the time. Blood stains on towels and a robe were not promptly followed up. And some forensic work that should have happened early in the investigation was not completed until years later. Years later. By then, the scene was gone. The party was history, and everything that had been missed in March 2001 could not simply be recreated. For Terry, this was vindication of one part of what he had been saying for years. Mistakes have been made, important opportunities have been lost, and those mistakes may have reduced the chances of ever establishing exactly what happened to Stuart. Essex police apologised to the family, but an apology could not restore the missing evidence. It could not put the thermometer back beside the pool. It could not return the investigators to that first morning. It could not give Terry the thing he wanted most: an answer. And there was another line in the police response that became important. Essex police said they believed somebody knew exactly what had happened to Stuart, but that information had not been shared with them. For Terry, that must have sounded painfully familiar, because it was essentially the argument he had been making for years. Somebody knew something. Maybe one person knew the whole story. Maybe several people knew different parts of it. But Terry believed the truth had never fully emerged. The problem was still the same. Belief is not evidence, suspicion is not enough, and a police force cannot charge someone simply because a grieving father is convinced that answers exist. It has to prove a case. That was what Essex police had failed to do, and every year that passed made it harder. By 2009, Terry had already spent almost a decade living inside that frustration. He had watched the original inquiry stall. He had sat through the inquest. He had watched 3 men arrested in the renewed investigation. He had watched all 3 released without charge. And now an independent review had confirmed that some of the best opportunities to gather evidence had been lost right at the beginning. There was no neat way around that. If the truth had been sitting inside the Roydon house on the morning Stuart died, some of the tools needed to uncover it were now gone. Terry could not recover them, neither could the police, so the campaign continued, and Michael Barrymore's battle continued too, because while Terry was still pushing for answers about Stuart, Barrymore had begun fighting Essex police over something else entirely: his 2007 arrest. Barrymore argued that it had been unlawful. He said it had caused enormous damage to his reputation and whatever remained of his career. Years later, that argument would reach the courts, and the result would be strange, because Barrymore would technically win one part of the argument and still walk away with almost nothing. By the time Michael Barrymore took Essex police to court, another decade had almost passed since his arrest. But for Barrymore, the events of the 14th of June 2007 were still very much alive. He'd been arrested on suspicion of rape and murder. His name had once again been pushed across front pages, and Barrymore argued that the damage to his reputation and career had been enormous. So he sued. Not because a court had cleared him of involvement in Stuart's death, not because new evidence had proved somebody else was responsible, but because of the way the arrest itself had been carried out. And that distinction is crucial. This case was not about Stuart's death, it was about police procedure. The officer who physically arrested Barrymore had not herself been given enough information to form the reasonable suspicion required by law. That made the arrest unlawful. In 2017, the High Court ruled in Barrymore's favour on that point, and initially it looked like a significant victory. Barrymore argued that the arrest had destroyed what remained of his career and claimed damages worth more than £2 million. But Essex police appealed, and the Court of Appeal looked at the situation differently. Yes, the actual arrest had been unlawful. That was not reversed. But the judges asked a second question. What would have happened if the police had followed the correct procedure? And their conclusion was that Barrymore could and would have been lawfully arrested anyway. In other words, the problem was not that police had no grounds to investigate him. The problem was that the officer carrying out the arrest had not personally been put in possession of the information needed to make it lawful. That technical distinction changed everything. In December 2018, the Court of Appeal ruled that Barrymore was entitled only to nominal damages. It was an unusual result. Barrymore had been right that his arrest was unlawful, but he had not won the sweeping vindication that the word unlawful might suggest. The court was not saying Michael Barrymore should never have been arrested. It was saying the arrest was carried out incorrectly. Those are very different things, and yet, in headlines and public discussion, distinctions like that can disappear quickly. Barrymore wins unlawful arrest case sounds very different from the detailed legal reality. For Stuart's family, none of it changed the facts they were living with. The civil case didn't identify who had injured Stuart. It didn't establish what happened in the Roydon house. And it didn't resolve the unanswered questions Terry had spent years pursuing. The legal battle was about Michael Barrymore and Essex police. Stuart's death remained unresolved. By then, Barrymore had spent years living with the case attached to his name. There had been attempts to return to entertainment, some small appearances, some renewed public interest, but nothing resembling the television career he had once had. Then in 2019 came something much bigger. ITV, prime time, and a programme watched by millions. Michael Barrymore was announced as a contestant on Dancing on Ice. For anybody who remembered the 1990s, there was something almost circular about it. The network that had once made him one of the biggest entertainers in Britain was preparing to put him back in a major Saturday night style entertainment format, not as the host, as a contestant. But still, Michael Barrymore was heading back towards ITV primetime. For Barrymore, it looked like another chance to remind viewers of the entertainer they had once known. He was partnered with professional skater Alex Murphy. Training began. Photographs were taken. Promotion started. And for a short time it looked as though this comeback might actually happen. Then Barrymore fell during training. He broke his wrist, and in December 2019 he withdrew from the competition before the series began. The comeback ended before he had ever skated competitively, but almost immediately another television programme was about to bring Michael Barrymore's name back into millions of homes. Only this one had nothing to do with entertainment. It went back to March 2001, back to Roydon, back to the swimming pool, and back to Stuart Lubbock. In February 2020, Channel 4 broadcast a documentary examining the case, and after nearly 19 years without an answer, something happened. Police received new information, enough information that, 1 year later, another man would be arrested. And for Terry Lubbock, already approaching the final moments of his life, there would be one last reason to believe he might finally learn the truth. February 2020. Nearly 19 years had passed since Stuart Lubbock had died. The case had faded from the front pages many times, but it had never completely gone away. Now it was back on national television. Channel 4 broadcast Barrymore, the body in the pool. For a new generation of viewers, the case was laid out again. The house in Roydon, the swimming pool, the injuries, the unanswered questions, and the failures that had haunted the investigation from the beginning. For Terry Lubbock, this was not old history. It was still his life. He'd spent almost 2 decades trying to persuade somebody to come forward with the piece of information that might finally explain what happened to Stuart. And after the documentary aired, police said they received new information. Enough to make the case move again. That mattered, because by then, Terry had learned something devastating. He had cancer, and it was terminal. Suddenly, 20 years of campaigning had become a race against time. Terry had always known there was a chance he might never get the answer he wanted. Now that possibility was no longer abstract. It was real. Doctors had told him his time was limited, and still, the case remained unsolved. Then in March 2021 came another development. A 50-year-old man was arrested on suspicion of Stuart's murder, an indecent assault. He was not Michael Barrymore. The rest followed the renewed police appeal and information received after the case returned to television. For Terry, it must have felt like one final door opening. After 20 years, after the failed investigations, after the inquest, after the 2007 arrests, after the police watchdog had confirmed mistakes in the original inquiry, someone was once again being questioned about Stuart's death. And this time, Terry knew he might not have years to wait and see where it led. A month later, he made what he described as his final public appeal. This was Terry Lubbock without a luxury of time. No more pretending there would always be another anniversary, another interview, another police review, another chance. He wanted people who knew something to speak, not eventually, now, because Terry's life was coming to an end, and the answer had still not arrived. For months the investigation continued. Then, in August 2021, police announced that the man arrested earlier that year would face no further action. They said there was insufficient evidence for a realistic prospect of prosecution. Another possibility had disappeared. No charge, no trial, no courtroom where evidence could finally be tested in front of a jury. And for Terry, there was almost no time left. Less than a month later, on the 15th of September 2021, Terry Lubbock died. He was 76. 20 years earlier, Terry had been a father whose son had gone out for the night and never come home. By the end of his life, he had become inseparable from the campaign to find out why. He had stood outside police stations, spoken to journalists, appealed directly to witnesses, challenged Essex police, met Michael Barrymore face to face, watched people arrested, watched them released, and through all of it, he kept asking the same thing. What happened to Stuart? He never got the answer, and there is something deeply cruel about that, because Terry had not spent 20 years demanding that one particular person be convicted, regardless of the evidence. What he wanted was something much simpler. He wanted the truth, an explanation he could believe, something supported by evidence, something that told him what happened to his son after he entered that house in Roydon. He died without it. But Terry did achieve one thing. He made sure Stuart was never forgotten. Without him, this case could easily have become another old celebrity scandal, a strange story from the beginning of the 2000s, a name people half remembered, a swimming pool, a television star. Terry refused to let that happen. Whenever the story drifted back towards Barrymore's career, Terry pulled it back towards Stuart. Whenever public attention moved on, Terry brought the case back, and even when his own health was failing, he was still asking people to speak. That is why, after all the headlines and all the speculation, the final part of this story belongs to Terry. Not because he solved Stuart's death, he didn't, but because he refused to accept that his son should simply disappear beneath the mystery surrounding it. And when Terry died in September 2021, the question passed to everyone else. Stuart was still dead. His injuries were still unexplained. No one had been convicted of causing them, and the man who had spent 20 years refusing to let the question disappear was no longer there to ask it. So the case remained unsolved. And more than 2 decades after that night in Roydon, the final answer was still missing. And so, more than 25 years after Stuart Lubbock died, this case remains unresolved. There have been investigations, arrests, an inquest, fresh appeals and countless hours spent trying to establish what happened inside that house in Roydon, but no one has ever been convicted of causing Stuart's injuries or his death. Michael Barrymore has always denied any involvement and has never been charged with causing Stuart's death. And despite everything that has happened since March 2001, we still don't know exactly how Stuart suffered those injuries, or how the final moments of his life unfolded. Terry Lubbock spent 20 years trying to change that. He never got the answer he was looking for, but he did make sure that his son's name was never forgotten, and I think that's where we should leave this story, with Stuart, not as a footnote in the story of a famous television presenter, not as the man in Michael Barrymore's swimming pool, but as Stuart Lubbock, a father, a son, a man who was just 31 years old when he went out for the night and never came home. And perhaps somewhere there is still somebody who can finally explain why. And that's it for this episode of What They Hide: Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight. As always, thank you so much for listening. If you've enjoyed the episode, please follow or subscribe to the podcast. And if you've got a moment to leave a rating or review, it really does help more people find the show. And if you know somebody who enjoys true crime, please share the episode with them. Every share genuinely helps the podcast grow. You can also support the show through Buy Me a Coffee, which helps me continue producing these episodes. Thank you, as always, for being here. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time on What They Hide: Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight.